Welcome to More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, a series of online debates brought to you by the Charles Koch Institute and the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. This series aims to foster vigorous, civil, and constructive debate on the future of American foreign policy. We break down big topics into bite-sized pieces, one question at a time.
Hello, my name is Adam Twardowski. I'm a senior research assistant at the Brookings Institution. Today, you're joining us for the first installment of our new series, More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, where we bring you short debates between scholars on big topics in foreign policy. You will find the full series at the link that appears at the end of this recording. Today's debate touches on something that is affecting all of us in significant ways. How, if at all, will the COVID-19 pandemic change the nature of the international system? Representing CKI today, we have Will Ruger, Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. And representing Brookings, we have Bruce Jones, Director and a Senior Fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. The rules are very simple. You each have 5 minutes to state your case before it goes to the other side. You may not interrupt. We have the power to mute you and are not afraid to use it. It will then go back to each side for a 1-minute rebuttal and then back to each side for a 1-minute conclusion. Today, we're going to start with Will. Will, how, if at all, will the COVID-19 pandemic change the nature of the international system? You have 5 minutes beginning now.
Great. Well, thank you for hosting us, and it should be fun. My friend Bruce Jones and I have had many conversations, and I'm sure that this one will equal those in terms of its, I think, civility, but also some disagreements. But let's see. So I guess what I would say is to try to be a little bit maybe counterintuitive and say that we'll have less change than may be expected by some. And a big part of that is because when I look at the nature of the international system, I think a lot about the relative material power of the different states in the system. And so, the balance of power, I think, still significantly favors the United States. And that should have an impact on the outcomes we see in the international system and the basic shape of the international system. So I think one thing I would say is, think about the United States. It still has a significant part, a significant amount of military power. Right? It still has the world's strongest army, it has the world's strongest navy, the world's strongest air force, and it also has another army in a sense in the Marine Corps. And so it has a lot of military power. It also has still a great amount of population, right? It's a country of over 300 million people. There's a lot of wealth and economic power, and those people have a lot of human capital. That is embedded in our technologies. And those technologies give us a lot of advantages, not just on the military side, but in terms of our economic strength. And there's still a fair amount of dynamism in the United States. And I know there are some commentators that worry about complacency or decadence, but the fact is the United States still has a significant amount of dynamism, again, relative to the rest of the world. Because again, we want to talk about relative power, not just look at it in terms of absolute power. There are some troubling aspects. So for example, it'd be very difficult today to not look at the country and worry about our social stability, which does affect ultimately our relative standing in the world and our ability to harness that power as necessary. We have a lot of debt. That's very troubling. We're over $25 trillion in debt. That's something that we have to worry about. But at least for right now, the fact is that that debt is something we have to worry about, but it's not immediately impacting us the way it might in the future. And then the other problem is that we've created a lot of own goals, not just our debt and deficits that are the product of fiscal irresponsibility in many ways, but own goals in terms of our foreign policy approach, which has squandered blood and treasure over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think a smarter approach would have essentially kind of harbored some of those resources for when we really needed them to secure our vital interests against threats that were necessary for us to confront, as opposed to some of the wars of choice, for example, that we've been fighting over the 20, 30 years of our past since the end of the Cold War. So what do we need to do right now? I mean, I think that right now there's three things we need to do to right our ship. And if we right our ship, then those advantages will allow us to maintain our position in the system and will mean that the system will be fairly similar to the pre-COVID world as the post-COVID world. So one of those is, of course, is that while dealing with the immediate economic problems, we do need to right our fiscal ship in the future. We need greater fiscal responsibility ahead. Secondly, we need to reform some of our domestic institutions because those are the cause of some of this social instability that we've seen. That includes criminal justice reform, for example, and that would be very helpful for us, I think, to get back to a closer approximation of the ideals that are found in our country's kind of founding documents. And then we need to fix our foreign policy like I just talked about. So that means, I think, engaging in a real conversation about what our grand strategy ought to be ahead, to rethink America's role in the world, not one in which the United States retreats from the world, but one in which the United States stays engaged, culturally engaged, diplomatically engaged, in terms of international commerce, but one in which America rebalances the role of its military power and its use of military power abroad, consistent with those interests. And that means greater realism and restraint in our grand strategy. That means ending our endless wars in the Middle East. It means asking our allies to increase their burden sharing. And it means thinking about China in a realistic fashion, neither being hysterical nor naive about the challenge that is posed by China's rise. So I think that's 5 minutes. So hopefully that was useful.
That's right. Thank you. Bruce, I'm going to hand it over to you right now. Again, how, if at all, will the COVID-19 pandemic change or affect the nature of the international system? Your 5 minutes begin now.
Well, thank you. And Will, good to be with you, albeit virtually. And as ever, there's good news and bad news, and that I agree with you more than we should for debate. Let me frame some things in a slightly different way. I want to make 4 points. First of all, I think we have to be clear that we are nowhere near the end of this crisis. We have seen the end of the first wave of COVID in the developed countries of the North, other than the United States, where a lethal combination of mendacity and incompetence have kept us in the first wave. The wave is still building in Latin America and in other places where health systems are weak and inadequate, and we're getting inadequate reporting. And there's almost certainly going to be a second wave, which will hit us and everybody else in the fall. So we're nowhere near the end of this crisis, and we have to be clear-eyed about that. Second, I agree with Will that this doesn't change fundamentals. Right? From the beginning of this crisis, people have been saying this changes everything. I don't think it changes anything in terms of the fundamentals. But what it does do is it takes pre-existing dynamics and amplifies them. And many of those dynamics were worrying already, and this makes them worse. US-China relations were deteriorating. This makes us worse. US-EU relations were strained. This makes it worse. The humanitarian situation in Yemen and Syria and Libya was bad. This makes it worse. Poverty reduction efforts around the world, after 2 decades of progress, had been stalling. Now they're going to go into reverse. Multilateral institutions were weak. This will make it worse. Support for free trade and globalization was eroding. This makes it worse. So in a whole series of pre-existing dynamics, I think the crisis will amplify those dynamics and leave us in a more difficult situation. In terms of the effect on American foreign policy, I see a mix of effects, a few positives and more negatives. On the positive side, it seems to me that it's likely to be the case that the COVID crisis will cause a renewal of focus on global and transnational threats, which had kind of been drowned out of late by the obsession with geopolitical relations and great power conflict. That doesn't mean that the geopolitical questions go away by any means, but I think they can be usefully rebalanced by recognizing that we are still exposed to transnational and global threats like biological insecurity, and climate change and the like. And the second positive is that we may, I emphasize may, see sustained efforts by middle powers in creative coalitions to kind of stem the bleed in the multilateral order, a kind of function that the US used to lead diplomatically. We may see others rising to that challenge. On the negative side, vis-a-vis, I think Will and I share a view on what we need vis-a-vis China, kind of steady, resolute strategy for the long game of limiting the negative effects of their more assertive policy and their greater power. Instead, what I worry about is that we're seeing things that look a lot more like enmity and a kind of ideological dimension to that relationship, which I think is dangerous. We'll be confronting worse situations around the world, from Yemen to Iran to Libya, etc. And the global economy will be in worse shape, as will ours. And all of that is going to make it more difficult to answer the question of how to handle the problems in a world of less American engagement. I think Will and I agree that the American military leadership in the Middle East and in other places has sometimes led to a worsening of the situation rather than a lessening of the situation. I'm very acutely conscious of the reality that in some places too little American engagement can also produce disastrous results. It's a long debate and we won't have time to go into it fully today. But it seems to me that there are a lot of situations where what we need to see is American diplomatic leadership, backed up sometimes by at least a partial willingness to use force, not led by force, but statecraft, diplomatic-led, but backed up by a willingness to use force, driving multilateral solutions, driving coalitions to solve some of the problems we are grappling with today. And if this episode leads to less American diplomacy and less American statecraft in a world already made worse by the crisis, then I think we'll be in serious trouble.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm going to hand it over now to Will for his 1-minute rebuttal or response.
I mean, there's a lot of smart things that Bruce said, so you know, maybe not so much a rebuttal as a kind of continuation of a conversation here, which is that I think one of the challenges we have is finding the right amount of engagement with the world, and also realizing that our actions can provoke unintended consequences, such as free or cheap riding, as well as buck passing. And so I think what we want to do is to make sure that we you know, aren't necessarily leading in ways and in places where others really should be you know, kind of you know, taking the initiative. It's not always the case that every aspect of global affairs is something that the United States has the same stake in as others, and therefore it may be commensurate upon others to take responsibility for that. You know, and you know, one of the problems I think with you know, what happened during the Cold War and then in the post-Cold War world is there was a sense that there was a seamless web of interests, as one scholar put it, where, you know, if you pulled on any kind of thread of that fabric of the international system, that there was the tear went through the entire sheet, as opposed to stopping at certain you know, places. And I think the fact is that the international system isn't like that. There are things that are happening in the world where the United States can step back and let others engage, because either they have more knowledge, more interest, or other things that allow the United States, again, to maybe take some level of kind of benign, kind of take the benign backseat, if you will. It doesn't mean the United States couldn't lend its diplomatic efforts, for example, but does the United States need to be at the tip of the spear in every situation in the world? And of course, the answer is no, because that's already the case, that we're not at the forefront of every conflict. Think of some of the conflicts that have happened around the globe over the last 30 years. We haven't been in all of them. But we've been in so many of them, even when the United States, it wasn't required for our interest to be at that forefront.
All right, thank you, Will. Over to you, Bruce, for your response. Unmute yourself, please, Bruce.
Sorry, I agree with much of what you said, Will, in principle. but it seems to me that the challenge we're going to confront is twofold. First of all, in many situations, the search for a diplomatic solution has to have at least some degree of American willingness to use force behind that diplomacy, a kind of classical statecraft approach. The actors who need to be brought to the table to these things aren't always going to be willing to come to the table for a diplomatic solution just out of goodwill. There'll need to be costs imposed or pressure placed, and it's usually the case that it's going to have to be the United States that imposes those costs. That's still a diplomatic-led approach rather than a military-led approach, but diplomacy doesn't mean no military engagement. Second problem, it seems to me, is that some of the places where us stepping back a little bit is most compelling, where the costs of us being in the front lines are highest, are also the places where the risks of escalation are greatest. I think about Japan, Korea, China relations. I think about Turkey, Russia, EU relations, places where you would think that the United States pulling back a little bit would lead wise people in Tokyo and Seoul to find better relations with one another, but we're seeing the opposite, where people in Ankara and Brussels would find ways to resuscitate their negotiations. We're seeing the opposite. So I worry that in the places where it's most difficult for us to sustain the will to be in a leadership role, the costs of not doing it are going to be highest. We're going to have to figure that out sort of case by case. I agree with you, it's not a seamless web. But some of those trade-offs are going to be very acute.
Okay, we've reached the conclusion of our debate. Will, we're going to go over to you first for your concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just follow what Bruce just talked about, which is that some issues, some regions are more important than others when it comes to America's vital national interest. And that means you have to do triage. And it's important if we do want to pay more attention, say, to the East Asian area of the world, then it means that we're going to have to make painful decisions potentially about which areas we deprioritize relative to that. And again, I think that means in the case of the Middle East and in Europe, a deprioritization from what they've been over the last 30 years. In the case of Europe, for example, Europe is larger than the United States in terms of its population, in terms of all of the countries of Europe. It also has economic power that dwarfs its only real geopolitical challenge, which is Russia. And so the fact is that Europe could take more of the burden on itself in dealing with its realm or its area of the world. And I think that whether you're a realist and believe in the relative power between Europe and Russia, or you just believe in the kind of pacifying nature of norms and institutions, the fact is that Europe is very different than it has been for hundreds of years. And so we have to pay less attention to that relative to, say, Asia, where maybe more of our focus needs to be ahead. And so I think that regardless of your views on overarching grand strategy, whether a restrainer or still somewhat of a primacist, the fact is that triage is going to be necessary. And the United States, I think, can responsibly do that by thinking carefully about where we have to kind of make those trade-offs and change our approach. And unfortunately, a lot of people, I think, still want to be able to be, want to have this overarching grand strategy and overarching foreign policy that has the United States consistently and deeply engaged on all margins in each of the three kind of major parts of the world and in areas that are indirectly or directly connected to those, which ends up being essentially a globe straddling approach.
Thank you, Will. And your final minute.
And we're about to enter a period in which a number of situations in the world that were already tenuous deteriorate still further. If that's met with less American engagement and less American leadership, that will almost certainly be a bad result. The trick is to meet it with the right kind of leadership, which is diplomatically led, premised on an older concept of statecraft, which blends the instruments of power against political goals. It doesn't lead with military power, but doesn't neglect it either, and is led by diplomacy. I agree with Will, we need to make hard trade-offs. What I like about the way Will put it is to recognize that they are difficult trade-offs. Sometimes in this debate, there's a sense that, I don't mean our debate, but the debate in Washington, there's a sense that either if we walk away from a situation, total chaos will automatically emerge, or that if we walk away from a situation, effective multilateralism will automatically emerge. In reality, the delta between those two things is often going to be the willingness of the United States or a coalition of middle powers to lead diplomatically to put a solution in place or the elements of a solution in place. And the choice that shouldn't be between the United States doing it all or the United States doing nothing. We need to get better at creative approaches to tackling problems led by statecraft, but not walking away from those problems.
All right, and that concludes our debate today. Great points on both sides. Thanks for watching More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, a project of the Charles Koch Institute and the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. I'm Adam Twardowski at Brookings. Special thanks to our guests today, Will Ruger and Bruce Jones. To join our mailing list and learn more about future events in this series, please visit our website on the final slide. Thank you.